Welcome to the Inside Sales Enablement Podcast. Where has the profession been? Where is it now? And where is it heading? What does it mean to you, your company, other functions, the market? Find out here. Join the founding father of the sales enablement profession, Scott Santucci, and trailblazer Brian Lambert as they take you behind the scenes of the birth of an industry. The Inside Sales Enablement Podcast starts now.
I'm Scott Santucci.
I'm Brian Lambert, and we are Sales Enablement Insiders. Our podcast is for sales enablement leaders looking to elevate their function, expand their sphere of influence, and increase the span of control within their companies.
Together, Brian and I have worked on over 100 different kinds of sales enablement initiatives as analysts, consultants, or practitioners. We've learned the hard way, underlined, hard way, what works and what doesn't.
Our podcast is different. We use a conversational format to help share the experiences that only people who've been there and done that can provide, as we've been pushing the envelope on the profession for over a decade. And today on this show, we are going to discuss Sales Enablement Defined. And as usual, we're going to start with a centering story to give our episode a theme. Scott, take it away.
Thank you, Brian. And I think you're going to like this, Brian. This is a very, very modern story for some of the stories that we've been talking about.
Oh, really? Did we move up? Did we move up a different century yet?
This story starts in 1933.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
We moved out of the 1800s. Nice.
Yes.
There we go.
I know. How about that for modernization? In 1933, the United States Congress passed the Securities Act. And what I'd like you to do is go back in the way back machine and have some context. This is the time of the Great Depression. If you remember what happened, one of the starting points of the Great Depression was the stock market decline of 1929. And one of the things that was happening is that those stocks that people were buying weren't really regulated. So you didn't really know whether the information was accurate or not. So the 1933 Securities Act put down and established the SEC, the Securities Exchange Commission, which also empowered them to audit and oversee and even send people to jail for fraud on the stock market. So that's what led to it. The next thing that happened in 1939, general accounting principles started. So basically what generally accounting principles are is that's the rules of which you organize or store financial data that gets logged into your business report, the business reporting, the financial reports, the balance sheet, the income statement, all of those things started back in got standardized back in 1933 with this SEC Act. But then the rules to make sure that you follow them and standardize all that started in 1939. So to bring that all to fruition, today in 1939, the idea of a chief financial officer was not very common. Today, the idea of a chief financial officer is almost, you can't even separate the idea of not having them. So one of the things that has led to the powerful rise of a CFO is they actually have this construct, these rules to follow, more or less like a lingua franca. And if it weren't for that, it'd be hard to say that the CFO would have evolved, because that role was just a bookkeeping function.
Yeah, that's a good point on the history of that evolution, to think from bookkeeper to CFO. But again, what the heck does that have to do with sales enablement?
So Insider Nation, I hope you're getting the gist that we always have some sort of weird or interesting plug-in. And the reason that this matters is because you've heard Brian and I talk a lot about a charter. You've heard us talking about that. But you don't have a core foundation to stand on, it's really hard to elevate your role. And that's really what we're talking about here is there are a lot of discussions about definitions and why you're defining things. Our lens when we set out to defining sales enablement was really more foundational. It's not, does it sound the right way? Because I can guarantee you, if you go and read the SEC's definition of what revenue is, it's not a good read. It's not simple or elegant or beautiful or accessible or explains what an accountant's job does. It's a very utilitarian definition to set a foundation to provide standards.
It's hard to blog that, I'm sure, too, that definition.
Yes, it is a tough blog because it's an incredibly tough read. But the reason that exists that way is because it must be precise. So that's really the essence of how we started about defining sales enablement when we were at Forrester. And the foundation for everything that we worked on was that definition. And it has a lot of principles behind it, with the idea of building as a foundation to build a function up on top of it. Yeah.
And I remember, you kept saying the key here is to get it right. And we're going to talk about how we did it. And yes, we're going to go over that definition on here. But, I feel like right now, this is a bit of let me challenge you on this, right? Like, one, we said we weren't going to necessarily redefine it. And then on the show. And two, we've said, listen, it's not about a definitional debate. We're not going to engage in that. And now here we are, right? So, and the reason why I wanted to bring that up is it's interesting to me that over the course of the last two conferences that I was at, that the definition that we put together in 2008 has shown up on, the main stage screen. And even your name is in Forrester have been used as this is the definition and that I like, et cetera. But why are we on this podcast doing this? Why do you think it's important to restate what we've already stated 10 years ago?
Well, I think there's a bunch of reasons why. There are many definitions out there. It's very confusing. And the reason that we're doing it for Insider Nation, it's actually kind of interesting. Brian, you and I started this podcast because we saw a big giant hole in sales enablement conversations from a more strategic lens. And as we started this, more people have been reaching out, and a lot of people have been reaching out saying, hey, I'm glad you guys are doing this. I've been really leveraging that old sales enablement definition. And I was actually in Chicago at a meeting, and the executive team had this definition, and they had it written up. So we haven't built on this thing in a long time, and the company that had owned this intellectual property has now, quote, discarded it in replacement of another one that's maybe better sounding or more well written. Mm-hmm. But really, the goal here is it's not an issue to debate definitions, and it's a conversation to say we try to lay foundations with this, and we want to talk about those foundations because those foundations are what separate most of the people who are running sales enablement as units of one and the sales enablement leaders who have strategic departments. So what we thought we would do is say, just as if you are interested in promoting and elevating your role, let's follow the game plan that accounting went through to become CFOs. They had a foundation that they built from, so we wanted to lay that foundation. We think that's relevant here for Inside Sales Enablement and Insider Nation.
Yeah, and let me state the obvious. We're sticking to the definition that we wrote in 2008. Exactly. We're not changing it. We're not redefining it. We're sticking with it, and we think it's even more relevant today than it was back then. And we're going to state it again. And here we go. Let's talk about why we did it, how we went about it, what the actual definition is, and who it's for. So let's start with why we defined it, Scott.
All right. So why do we find it? So the first lens is we made an observation that there is a gap between the go-to-market strategy or even the business strategy of a company and how it executes. So that was the observation that we laid. Then when we looked at and examined that business problem, what did we do is based on that gap, we tried to define what should be in the middle there to bridge that gap. And that's really where we came up with the idea of sales enablement. The idea being go-to-market is about interacting with customers. We were thinking about sales, aka meaning revenue or bookings, not sales, the sales force. And enablement is to make sure we're enabling the execution of that strategy and profitable growth. That was the lens that we had. So that's why we created it, and we didn't see any work in that space. And we, frankly, Brian and I still haven't seen any work in that space.
Yeah, and also to piggyback on the why, to drill a little bit deeper on that is I actually think the gap is getting bigger. That the gap between go-to-market and the expectations that customers have continues to widen.
Yeah, and I think that I agree with you. And I think the reason that it's widening is really because of the whole digital economy that we're in. You've got businesses, we've talked about some of this before, but you've got businesses who were office furniture companies, and they are now becoming space optimization businesses because of this whole digital world. So I think that is one of the driving forces that is illuminating or accelerating that gap between strategy and execution. And most companies don't have what Brian and I like to call an execution fabric to tie all those pieces together.
Yeah, and to that end, execution is extremely problematic, right? So we're not going to get into that, but what I would say is we can't let the idea of product marketing or messaging or demand gen or even sales enablement trump the idea of execution.
Right.
Execution is the most important thing here.
That's right.
And let's figure out, back then we had this debate, what needs to fill that gap? Because silos are not getting us there and sales conversations are suffering. What might that look like? How might we go about defining that? So let's pivot there. Let's explain how we went about defining that. Did we lock ourselves in a conference room and write it? Make it look good?
So the sequence of events were, and this is where the sort of the discipline of research, and why I would recommend all of you, before you pick a definition that you use, go and find out what's behind it. Just because it sounds good doesn't mean it is good. So the way that we went about doing it is we first shopped this observation, right? So I'm sorry if I'm going to sound like dusting off past memories of high school, but if the scientific method is you start with an observation. So we had the observation of a gap between strategy and execution. And then what you do before you develop a hypothesis is you get some reviews. So we interviewed executives based on that observation from companies like Accenture, BMC, Computer Associates or CA, Citrix, CSC, Dell, HP, IBM, NetApp, Oracle, SAP, and Symantec. And what we did there is say, is this phenomenon that we're observing something that you're observing too? So we went and confirmed that hypothesis. So the confirmation was yes, that occurred. Then we went and looked at financial reports and pulled out some trends of other businesses that were happening. So we pulled out examples of CEOs and from annual reports that provide proof points of this gap. So we saw that executives are focusing on pragmatic, profitable growth, continuing to retool the sales engine, eliminating waste, trying to drive differentiated at the point of sale, transforming rep seller behavior outside of their comfort zone, were all trends that we saw way back in 2008. Do they sound familiar today, Brian?
Yes, they definitely do. Sound the same. They're actually getting more heightened, and new business models are actually emerging to tackle those things. And then, too, when you rattled off the list of those companies have evolved and they're still around, and some have been on the ropes, but they've all gone through some sort of evolution. And I think that was a good sample set there to use, right? You 10 years later, these companies are still respected, and they've gone through their own evolutionary change.
So the second thing that we did to confirm the observation was maybe it makes sense to get a buyer's viewpoint of the gaps between execution. This is all before defining it. This is the work that we did before that. So what we did is, because we're Forrester, well, geez, we already have access to buyers, so I just interviewed some. actually many. And here's some of the trends that we observed. Buyers are stratifying their suppliers into a caste system. We saw many efforts underway. Actually, there were many people at Forrester that do vendor analysis and the like, and saw a lot of vendor consolidations. Actually, real strategic programs to move people into procurement. Another one is that buyers are differentiating among vendors based largely on their engagement strategy. In other words, what we found is that buyers prefer to work with the companies based on the way that the sellers engage with them, not what their products and services are. That's a myth. We found that to be a myth, that the branding is the preference or the price point was the preference. Another thing that the third observation that we found in engaging with those buyers is that they rarely find value from conversations that they have with vendor salespeople. As a matter of fact, the data that we had at the time was less than 15% of executives found that their interactions with sellers was valuable. So what that held us to ask the question is, if these things are going on, that the buyers aren't really valuing it, companies are spending a tremendous amount of money, something's got to give. So
yeah, and when you look at that, the buyer side that you mentioned, the caste system, that we're going to differentiate based on how people engage with us, and this idea of relevant conversations and what that looks like. I think there's been fuel put on that fire on the buyer side. You've got challenger sale now, challenger buyer, but more importantly, you have this idea that buyers and the people involved are really having a hard time making decisions. 6.2 people are involved. This idea of the caste system is becoming, bipolar, if you will, or two groups now instead of multiple groups. There's either that you're in a transactional sales pattern or buying pattern, and you're in a highly consultative one, and the middle ground is hard to occupy. So
I think you're right. So going back to the scientific method of where we were, right? We have this observation about a gap between strategy and execution. Then we did the research to see whether it's true. So we talked to people if that was a valid thing. Then we looked at financial reports and earnings calls to get some data there. We collected data from buyers, and then we went back inside the resident companies and made observations there. And those observations really came up with this observation of random acts of sales support underlying the ability to execute. So we found that companies are spending 15.9% of their SG&A on stuff to enable sales conversations. We found that the fragmentation of these efforts confuse customers. We found that because that information is all over the place, it creates an organizational drag. I'm wondering if all of the different definitions of sales enablement that haven't been thoughtful, is that's what's driving a lot of this activity, that we're being so focused on getting something out the door and not worrying about making it coordinated, that's creating more of the problem? I don't know.
Well, if you look at today, worker productivity continues to go down in the United States. SG&A, we haven't done the analysis. I don't know if you have, Scott, in other areas, but SG&A investments either are holding or they're continuing to increase, is my guess. I don't know if you've done any of that research on the current SG&A trends, but still seeing money being thrown at the idea here to drive revenue. So I think that continues to be a challenge.
Well, here's the thing that's most shocking to me. So we calculated based on a model that we use to assess what spending is in sales enablement. And keep in mind, our point of view of sales enablement spending is anything that's meant to go to support sellers. So because I'm not saying this isn't, if your sales enablement budget is the sales training and the sales kickoff, I'm counting you, but I'm also counting all of the content assets. I'm also counting the demand generation. There's many things that to me, if it's money that's sales facing, that's a sales enablement spend, period. Now, given that, back at the time, we calculated that it's $135,000 per rep per year. Well, I actually developed a methodology. You've seen it, Brian, the hidden cost of sales support methodology. And when I've ran that with companies, I've seen that number be as high as $650,000 of sales enablement support each year for sellers. That includes all the overlays that people put on top of things, or the bureaucracy that they do. Every time you make it where salespeople aren't spending time selling, these costs pick up and add up at a huge level.
Yeah, and that's per rep per year. So
per rep
635,000 per rep per year. That's,
per rep per year.
Yeah, that can add up. I think if there are any sales managers listening, they'd like to get their hands on that money and spend it perhaps a little bit differently.
Right, exactly. At $600,000 or even $135,000, which our analysis was, how much of that should be going to giving raises to sales managers? How much of that, would a top rep say, you know what, I'll take zero enablement and the $135,000 and pocket it. Tell you what, I'll take $100,000, pocket it. I'll give you the 35 back, and I'll build all my stuff.
That's right, because I can go on Fiverr and they'll do what I want.
Right, exactly. I'll take the $35,000 to build it on Fiverr, right? And then I'll pocket the $135,000 myself.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, well, I'm getting a little queasy here because, that's a little bit sickening because these things have well-intentions. People are well-intentioned. They want to help sales sell. They just don't know what they don't know. And we're pouring money into it. It's kind of back to our Brooklyn Bridge analogy where we threw headcount at the Brooklyn Bridge try to figure out how to overcome the bends. This one is, let's keep throwing money at it.
That's right. So let's talk about how we defined it then. So how we defined it is we did all that research. We posted all of that information together. So you imagine that putting together in a briefing, and we invited executives. Half were CMOs, half were VPs of sales. And we gave them that overview. Of course, they're like, yep, this is a problem. We haven't addressed it because we can't get sales and market. We don't have any context. We're trying to focus on how to align. You're asking us to fix a problem. The big difference, a big psychological difference between aligning departments and actually fixing this invisible problem. Mm-hmm. So here's the definition that we arrived at. So the point being, no, we didn't sit in a conference room and pontificate a definition. That's the work that went into how we did it. So here it is. Sales enablement is a strategic, ongoing process that equips all client-facing employees with the ability to consistently and systematically have a valuable conversation with the right set of customer stakeholders at each stage of the customer's problem-solving lifecycle to optimize the return of investment of the selling system. That was our definition.
Yeah, and we'll have this in the write-up and the notes, but just if you're listening, sales enablement it's strategic, it's ongoing, it equips all client-facing employees, it's consistently and systematically having a conversation with the right set of stakeholders against or with or at each stage of the customer's problem-solving cycle, not their buying process, but how they solve problems, in order to return, drive a return, optimize a return on investment of this overall selling system, which does exist. It's a thing. And that's the definition. And we're going to break it down here and walk through it.
Well, before we break it down, there's another part to this that is often not factored in.
That's because I think it's 6 pages later. Might be why.
Well,
But right. Let's do it. Because there's an implication if you're going to tackle it of what's required. So what's required to accomplish this?
Right. So the reason that we broke it down this way is because in working with our executives, there's sort of a sequence of events that goes into it. So sequence of events number 1, define for me the business problem. Sequence of events number 2, show me the work that led up to it. So that was the buyer research, the finance research. Sequence of events number 3, highlight the business problem for me. What is this costing us? That's point number 3, random acts of sales enablement and a cost per. Sequence of event number 4, define the scope of what it is that you're doing. Tell me what it is. Tell me what this process is that we must do in order to solve that problem. Sequence events number 5, what should we do? So here's the next part of that definition. To accomplish this goal, portfolio, marketing, and sales teams must work cross-functionally to create effective sales content and programs that map to a holistic customer model that are delivered on a common platform. Yeah. Those are the 2 parts.
Those are the 2 parts. And I would say, if you are listening to this and you're like, oh, that is too much, it's too heavy, nobody will ever go for that. I would encourage you to go back and re-listen to the front end of this, because the goal of this definition is to not make it super digestible into a tagline. The goal of the definition, remember, is this idea of we're moving from bookkeeping to CFO. We have to define through a sequence of events what the problem is and give it an identity so that it can be tackled. This is indeed a complicated problem, and it is indeed, a massive business impact.
Yeah. So, let me add to that, Brian. To add to that point, the question is, what are you going to use a definition for? If you're going to use a definition because you want to put it up to your boss to make a quick decision about what your role should be, well, yes. First of all, the reason that this isn't written for that, you wouldn't use it for that. We think that's a piss poor strategy. If you're trying to just say, hey, I'm going to go throw something to you to give you, to help you understand what I'm doing, the only way anybody's going to be able to understand it is through a very narrow scope. So guess what your remit's going to be? Build us sales playbooks, manage the sales training program, and you're always going to be stuck in that tactical box. You're always going to be a plumber. If you treat your role like a plumber, you're going to be a plumber.
And plumbers are highly technical, and they put a lot of work into that. But the idea of, hey, I want to be an architect it's a bridge too far. Once you're a plumber, that's really good. Yeah. And I think the other piece of that is important is we're asking our sellers to sell a vision. We're asking our sellers to transform how companies work. We're asking our sellers to sell business results and business outcomes. If in sales enablement we back off because this is a little bit complicated, that's hypocritical to me.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I mean, let me just tell it like it is. That's a bit ridiculous. And, are we enabling sales execution or not? And you know what? This definition, you didn't make it, it's not like we sat around and said, how do we make this more complicated? This is too short. Let's make it longer.
Let's set out to show how smart we can be.
Yeah.
That is just doing it to show how smart you are. It's a lot of big words.
Yeah. And we're getting a little bit emotional on this because the challenge at the time, and it continues to be, is we're reflecting reality. We're not the ones who made it complicated. This is the companies, the organizations going through a transformation to try to close the gap to customers. And there's a lot of money being spent, $70 billion on training development, $62 billion on technology. That's just 2 buckets.
Right.
We're talking about, competitiveness of countries and GDPs of countries at some point with this.
Exactly. And you're not picking up the head count that goes with it, and you're not picking up the content that's spent, the money that's spent on content.
Right. So rant over. I'll take a deep breath, but I think if folks are hanging with us, and I wanted to get people to resist the urge to punch out of this discussion, because now let's get a little bit more real around what to do next, because this is not a definition for definition's sake.
Exactly. And I think the other point there is, what problem is it that you're trying to solve? The definition that we're trying to solve for is the gap between strategy and execution and the poor performance associated with that. That's the problem that we're addressing. That's the problem that we see in pretty much every company that doesn't have a role like this, because execution requires cross-functional, because it requires it to be done well cross-functionally. And there is not a role that exists inside companies that look at this cross-functionally. So that's why we're so insistent on our perspective. So where do we want to take this next, Brian?
I think let's talk about what the upside is here. Let's go optimistic, and let's say, for those that have adopted this definition, what's happened to them in their careers, and then two, for companies that have embraced this type of thinking, what's happened to them? Do you have any couple stories that you can share on either the individual side or the corporate side?
Let's talk about specifically roles. So in terms of roles, the people who have been, there's always the type of folks who dive into something and want to understand it, and there's types of people who read something on the surface. The people who have taken this definition and really dove in and focused on the meaning, well, we typically find them at VP levels, and many are now reporting to CEOs because this problem is becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. Companies that have adapted it at scale, I'm thinking of one in particular. You remember this company, Brian. One particular company adopted it so well all the way up to the CEO. For their growth strategy, they would select a hand number of accounts and then say to the rest of the industry, if you're not one of these accounts, we're not going after you. Like that's how aggressive they were about it. They always hit the number, and their profitability and overall revenue growth was always just through the roof. So the issue and the statistics behind the execution of this are all really great. The difficulty is there isn't a environment to talk like this because we're in the sales enablement world in a lot of ways is we're in a bit of a echo chamber.
Operational go do, and our
Right.
value is in doing.
It's activity, 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 not what can we do to bend the needle.
Yeah. So for the Insider Nation, we want to talk to you. So inside your organization, it might be difficult to have conversations. Here on this podcast, it's not. So come join us over here. We'll talk about it, and we'll bottle it up, and we'll be that voice for closing the gap to customers. Not because it's cool, sexy, and we want to be VPs, but because by golly, sales people need help, and that's why Scott and I do what we do. And you might think this is a glamorous thing, but it's not sometimes. And we get the arrows a lot of times for what we're doing, but the why behind what we do is to help salespeople be successful and help sales managers really take back what's theirs around being custodians of that sales team. And
Right.
That's a critical need in companies today, and we want to continue those conversations.
So how you get started in thinking like this? Let me give you some three ideas. Right. Idea number one is take this definition, think about it, and break it down. So for example, strategic. What does strategic mean? To me, it definitely means having part of the remit about bridging the gap between strategy and execution. So it's as simple as like connecting the dots. This is like Legos. So if that's going to be your remit, then you need to ask yourself, well, what roles are touching that right now? Where is there room for you to fill in without being confrontational and saying, well, I want product marketing's budget and I want this. That's not a good strategy on getting started on this path. A good strategy would be to take inventory of the different parts, figure out the remits, and then find where the gray area is, then propose you'll fill in the gray area. I like to start as small as possible, because once you start finding those linkages and start collecting the data, you're going to be able to really, really highlight lots of challenges. Step number 3, make the CFO or somebody in finance who can help you do the analysis your friend. Make it quantifiable. That's why we created the hidden cost analysis. That's why we have these these tools and these metrics, it is extremely important to calculate what the cost of random acts enablement are if you're going to want this kind of role. We spend a lot of time talking about stakeholder management, but one of the things that we're not talking about is, stakeholder management, how do we quantify the problem? So 3 things would be: take the definition to heart, break it down, but really understand what the with the scope of sales enablement being a bridge between the strategy and execution, and envision what that would look like, come up with frameworks to talk about it. Step number 2, take an inventory of the different gaps in different groups and connect the dots. And step number 3, make a friend in finance, quantify it.
There you go. And great advice. And so let's wrap it up. As always, enlightening conversation, Scott. I enjoyed it. I got a little bit heated there for a second around the why, but it's just passion. And I think we both have that passion, and it's always good to talk about this. And I want to encourage our listeners to reach out and continue this conversation. We'll be at the Sales Enablement Society conference where we can talk about some of these things. And, for those that are out there fighting that fight in this battle, we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear your stories and examples, and also, quite frankly, challenge us on the ability to execute against this. And that's how we learn, and that's how the rising tide lifts all boats, in my opinion. So thanks so much. We'll talk to you guys later. Take care.
Thanks for joining us. To become an insider and amplify your journey, make sure you've subscribed to our show. If you have an idea for what Scott and Brian can cover in a future podcast, or have a story to share, please email them at engage@insidese.com. You can also connect with them online by going to insidese.com, following them on Twitter, or sending them a LinkedIn request.